Now, just a little warning before we begin, there will be major spoilers in this video for the 6th episode of Andor, so if you have not seen it yet and you don't want anything ruined, it is a really good time to click away. Okay, so after 2 episodes of what you could call build-up or a slow burn, we got an action-packed, tension-filled episode that is arguably one of the best, most suspenseful things Star Wars pretty much ever. And that's mainly because we didn't know exactly how this heist was going to play out. We didn't have a bunch of legacy characters running around that we knew were going to be A-okay in the end. We weren't sure who might live or who might die. Beyond Cassian, of course, we knew he was more or less going to come out of this just fine. But I mean, we knew something was going to go wrong. We just didn't know what and how badly. And I was kind of happy to see that, by and large, the plan actually did work. This wasn't one of those times where one thing after another goes wrong and it ends up being a total improvisation in the end. It was just the one communications expert or officer or corporal on the Imperial side intercepting their signals, then putting it all together, figuring out that something was going on, and then mustering up a few men to check things out, which led to a firefight that got several of our characters killed. But I'm of course getting way ahead of myself, so let's start at the beginning. First, let me just take a quick moment to remind you that, as usual, I'll be doing a follow-up video to this one, a Let's Talk Some Andor video over on my second channel, probably in a couple days, where I'll be reading and responding to some of the comments left on this video, some of your thoughts and opinions on this episode. That said, let's take it from the top, from the start of the episode, where we see that Nemec, the young kid, basically is having this conversation with Andor, who technically should be pretty young himself still. Either way, they're having this conversation where Nemec is saying how he can't sleep, and he's kind of surprised to see that Andor can. Again, just kind of giving the perspective of this is Nemec's first really big mission, whereas Andor has kind of been there and done that. We know he has been in the fight since, well, he was 6 years old. He's even told us about some of the battles he's been in, like on Mimban. Anyway, Nemec talks about how he believes in something, so why is he so unsettled? Meaning that if he happens to die, he should still have peace, that he knows he's giving his life to something. Whereas Andor doesn't believe in anything, so why is he so calm, knowing that he could die tomorrow and his life could essentially mean nothing? Not that he's trying to be so crude or cruel to Andor, but he doesn't understand how he could have so much faith and be so scared, while Andor has no faith and is seemingly not afraid at all. We then get Nemec talking about how mercenaries like Andor can be important in the struggle for freedom against the Empire, that they can be used as a tool. Andor kind of says that none of this really matters to the Empire. They don't care about you or anything else. They don't take anything seriously because, well, they don't feel like anything threatens them. Cassian then ends this conversation by saying something rather prophetic, that you'll sleep when it's done, and of course we know that Nemec will not survive this, though that's not what he's implying. He's saying that once the nerves calm down, once everything goes back to sort of normal, and you survive, you'll be able to finally sleep again. And I really enjoyed this scene, and I have enjoyed what they've been doing between Nemec and Cassian, kind of showing that Cassian has been there and done that again, while Nemec is this kid who has all these principles that he believes in, that he has formed in his youth, even though he has no experience. He doesn't really know how the galaxy works. He's writing his manifesto based off these beliefs that have not been tried and tested, essentially. Not to say that they aren't correct in a manner of speaking, but again, you have this idealistic kid but conversing with this guy who has been there and done that and trying to explain to him that things do not work in the real world as they work in your head when you're young. Next up, we have another really, really good scene between the Commandant J-Hold, who we are first meeting, and he's talking to the visiting Colonel Pettigar. And it's about how the Dahanis are a simple people. He talks about how their traits make them vulnerable to manipulation, that on a practical level they can't hold multiple ideas in their head, and so the Empire offers them alternatives to confuse them, and they're so busy trying to choose these alternatives that they can't figure out that they've been giving nothing they originally want. He then goes on to say how their deeper problem is pride, that they would rather lose and suffer than accept defeat, which he finds ironic because they've basically choked down everything that the Empire has thrown at them over these past 10 years or 12 years. And what I love about this, not that it's a good thing, mind you, is that it shows how the Empire kind of destroys a culture, that it destroys something that's just in their way. That's all they view them as a nuisance, essentially. And he talks about how, you know, when they first came, there would be 15,000 people that would make this 10-day trek up from the lowlands. Now it's 500, and they're putting distractions along the way to even dwindle those numbers down further. There's only 60 people showing up for this very, very important, essentially, festival or every 3-year occurrence to these people. And I think what makes it interesting is if you really want to destroy a people, you destroy their culture, you destroy their history, you destroy their heritage, you destroy everything that they once stood for, and you distract them with things that really don't matter. And you could make some interesting comparisons even to the modern world, how many people today are distracted by, well, a lot of things that don't really matter to them. They're obsessed with these certain things, and they have lost any sense of tradition and values that we once had. But that's a whole other conversation for another time, perhaps. This conversation then basically wraps up with the Colonel asking if these people know that this valley, this sacred valley, is going to be destroyed. And all the Commandant really says to that is ultimately they will return because we need plenty of arms and legs to build what they have planned. Essentially saying that they're going to bring them back to destroy the thing that they once coveted, but now that only 500 to 60 of them will actually bother showing up for anymore. Again, they've shown how they have destroyed the culture and that they are now going to just use these people for their own purpose. We then move on and find out that our team is going to be used something called a battle radio that they'll be able to lock into each other's signal and avoid the interference that they'll be creating. They use the call sign Echo 1, which is kind of a callback or Easter egg to The Empire Strikes Back and Echo Base, I suppose. We then get this conversation between Skeen and Cassian talking about how Taramyn used to be a stormtrooper. They talk about how mad Cinta was when she first found out, considering her whole family was slaughtered by stormtroopers. And it's again setting up more of the axe and the tree, which was the name of last week's episode, how all of these people in this fight, they have a cause, they have a reason. This is the worst thing that ever happened to them, and that's why they're fighting the Empire, whereas the Empire simply doesn't care about these people. Another thing I think this might be doing is setting up stormtroopers to actually be quite terrifying when we finally see them. Keeping in mind we haven't seen actual stormtroopers. We've seen certainly soldiers fighting, but they haven't been the efficient military unit that I think stormtroopers are going to be portrayed as in this, that I'm hoping they get portrayed as in this. They have kind of become a meme over the years, that they are kind of these grunts that can't shoot and all of these things. So I hope this show is really going to turn that around and make stormtroopers be frightening. We then have the Dahanis arrive at their sacred temple and are ready for the eye opening. And we see how the Empire treats them. They're trying to kind of placate them. They're trying to kind of pretend like they actually care about their traditions and rituals, even though they're the reason why their traditions are ending and dying. We then get a soldier taking a leak, which is, I think, the first time we've seen anybody go to the bathroom in Star Wars, other than in Rebels. They talk about the refresher in Rebels at one point. But anyway, just something worth noting, I suppose. We then move on to the Commandant putting on his dress uniform and complaining that it was stored improperly and it's all compressed. And then his wife says, perhaps you've expanded. It's kind of that usual classic scene that we see where someone tries to put on an old uniform, it doesn't fit anymore, and they blame the uniform instead of acknowledging they've put on weight. And this, of course, will kind of play in later when our Commandant here will have a heart attack doing actual physical work for like 10 minutes. Anyway, we see him sort of berating his son, and it's clear that he's not a very good person, that he calls his son weak, essentially, right in front of him, and maybe doesn't have the best marriage, that they've all kind of suffered, and he's telling them to put on a good show so that they can impress the Colonel and maybe get off of this planet eventually. And this, of course, again, does a good job at kind of humanizing the Empire, showing that they have families and that sometimes maybe they don't get along so well with those families, and that they have their own hopes and desires, that they are kind of the opposite of the rebels who are kind of banding together for an actual cause and purpose, though, as we'll see later, even the rebels don't always band together so well. Another little scene that I really enjoyed was when Lieutenant Gorn was welcoming the Dahani to the valley, and he's kind of talking to this chieftain or spiritual leader, whatever this guy is. He's kind of featured in the episode. And this chieftain says to him that he hopes the eye stays open long enough to find some good in you. And when you consider that earlier in the episode, Lieutenant Gorn had mentioned that the eye is always open, that the Aldani believe it never actually shuts, he's kind of saying that there's no chance of really ever finding good in you. But what he maybe doesn't know, that this chieftain doesn't know, is that Lieutenant Gorn kind of understands his people, which he probably thinks they wouldn't. He probably thinks the Empire doesn't care at all about them, which gets shown throughout the episode. And yet Lieutenant Gorn is the one person we know actually does care. He fell in love with a Aldani woman who was killed or something happened to her. So it's kind of ironic that he's saying this to Gorn of all people. And speaking of the Empire and their relationship with the Aldani people, we get the scene with the Commandant, the Colonel, and Lieutenant Gorn talking about how they trade a goat's hide for a 3-year lease. And I'm not sure that I like the use of the word goat here. I wish they would have given this weird, strange, multi-horned goat a different name besides goat. But whatever, the point is made that the Empire again just kind of belittles them, sees them as these primitive people who will trade a goat hide for their lands. I also really like the tiny, small details in this scene, like when Lieutenant Gorn walks past the Commandant's wife and she kind of smiles at him and he nods at her. Not that there's any weird thing between them, but it shows how kind of friendly and warm his wife probably is as a person. Kind of sets up later when they are being held captive that you're going to care that they might live or die in this situation. Next, we then see Vel and Cinta sneak into the base. They use the waterway and they plant some sort of device that will interrupt the Empire's communications. We then see that the other team is kind of waiting for the signal, the yes, we're going, or the no, call it off. And we have this conversation, this little quick scene between Cinta and Vel, where we see that Vel is kind of terrified of making the call because she knows whatever goes wrong is now kind of on her shoulders, or at least that's how she's going to feel. So whoever dies, she feels she'll be responsible for. Cinta then basically calls her out, and eventually Val gives the green light, and the mission is on. We then see that Lieutenant Gorn has set it up so that Cassian and the team will be the ones who escort the Commandant and his family and the Colonel into the base, where we'll get this nice little scene of a guard kind of sitting around just waiting, again, humanizing the Empire a little bit, showing that, yes, these are just people doing their job a lot of the time, and he snaps to attention as soon as the doors open and as soon as the Commandant enters. Anyway, this is where the team, where Cassian and the others make their move, and they pull their guns on the Colonel and the others, and I find it interesting that the Colonel was calling for the boy to be let go, and even his own father wasn't. It really makes you wonder what kind of guy this Colonel is, or was, because he's going to be shot a moment later by Cinta when the other two show up. Vel and Cintas then have a nice little moment before they go their separate ways, and Vel asks her to tell me you're going to be alright, which is maybe setting up something down the road because we know that these two will end up both alive, though Vel gets away and Cinta is left on the planet. I don't think that was part of the plan, but it almost seems like it was because they didn't even mention waiting around for her. So not sure what that's all about just yet. I also noticed that during this they kept using Cassian's fake name. They kept calling him Clem right in front of the Empire, and I'm curious if that was kind of to throw the Empire in doubt once they escaped, that they would be looking for this guy named Clem, and they realized that Clem wasn't even Cassian's real name. Nemec even points this out earlier in the episode that it's probably not his real name. We then find that the men who are on duty are gambling, which again, just humanizing the Empire, showing that they are normal people kind of doing a job, and not all of them are for the cause. Again, like the rebellion, we are separating these two. And it seems like the Commandant actually has concern for his men. He tells them to cooperate. Now, is that for his own safety because he doesn't want to die? Is it for their safety? Is it for the safety of his family? Is it a combination? Again, we don't exactly know what's motivating him. We know he doesn't get along so well with his family, or he's kind of cruel and mean to them, or at least was during this important event. So again, it kind of adds a little flavor to this guy. It makes us wonder, who is he really beneath this uniform that doesn't fit so well? Finally, then, they use the hand of the Commandant to get into the vault. He tells them they won't get any further, which, of course, they will. Skeen goes into the vault, and he has this kind of look on his face, and I wonder if this is the moment he decided to betray them, or if he'd long since decided that, or if it comes later. But he does have this rather curious look on his face that seems to be enchanted by all the money that he could, if he wanted to, kind of weasel his way into stealing for himself. We then have the Alkanzi airbase checking in, saying that there has been a vault breach indicator, and the corporal kind of gets this message. He, again, is putting things together. He realizes something is going wrong. He gets a little team together to go check it out. And all of this happens as the eye begins to finally open, and as these villagers who have made the trek to their sacred valley begin to celebrate. It's all kind of interchanged or juxtaposed very nicely. I like that we kept flashing back to the villagers, seeing that this is something so sacred to them, and yet it's being used as cover by these rebels to steal all this money. Eventually then, Lieutenant Gorn shows up, and the Commandant is, of course, stunned to see one of his officers has betrayed him, and he says he'll hang for this. And Gorn's response is perfect. 7 years serving you. I deserve worse than that, saying that what I have done under you in your name or the name of the Empire is worse than anything I could do by stealing this money from the Empire. Next, we had one of the coolest, best scenes in the whole episode, and no, I'm not talking about the eye, even though that was pretty spectacular. I'm talking about the TIE fighters and the pilots and getting ready to launch, and in classic Star Wars fashion, there were no railings to be found anywhere on those high-up platforms. I don't know why they don't have railings in Star Wars most of the time, but I'm glad to see that was something that they, kind of an Easter egg that they put in there. We then have the corporal who's been putting it all together show up at the vault with his team, and he demands to know what's going on. I like that Gorn tries to play it off as some sort of secret mission that he's not privy to, that this is above his pay grade, and he needs to get out of here. Gorn tries to get the Commandant to say the same, but he collapses from a heart attack. And again, timing is a little sketchy there, but of course it has been set up earlier with him having put on weight, and this is probably the first time he's physically exerted himself in years. That's the implication here. Anyway, the firefight begins, and Gorn immediately gets shot in the right shoulder. So could he have survived that? Will he be captured and interrogated and kind of give some information about who helped him along the way? Hard to say. Either way, the action here is really well done. We've been building to this for 2 episodes, and the tension is great because we have no real clue who is going to live or die on either side, other than Cassian, of course. And the whole tension of this episode is fantastic. You feel like you're on the edge of your seat the whole time, waiting to see what is going to go wrong. And again, only this one thing goes wrong. I'm glad it wasn't just one thing after another after another. That's kind of cliche. I'm glad it kind of goes as planned. Anyway, one of the Imperials then tries to be the hero and take out Cassian before he can get the ship in the air, but Nemec ultimately is the one who shoots him. He is the one who saves Cassian's life in this case, which will come into play in a little bit when Nemec's life is in jeopardy. We also see that Harmon is shot, and he appears to be dead. We flash back to him, and he isn't moving at all. Again, he could technically be alive, but I think there's a better shot that Lieutenant Gorn is still alive, considering he gets shot and then we don't see his body at all, which means he could be rolling around on the ground a little bit. But do you think the others would have noticed that and said something if he was? Or maybe they just conveniently didn't notice that. Either way, they end up getting away. Most of them get away, except for, of course, the ones who are shot here. And we also have Cinta, who is off doing her own thing. Now, again, I don't know if that was part of the plan to leave her behind or not, and to pick her up later, or if she's doing something else. No idea, but it is, again, curious to note that she is still on the planet. And the Empire should be able to put together that she did not escape with the others, considering she was on the bridge area or whatever, watching the other prisoners, and that they would have left before she had a chance to get to them. Or at least so I'd assume. So they may be looking for her on the planet still, who knows. Either way, when the ship finally takes off, we see that a pallet of credits essentially crushes Nemec's back. He can't feel his legs anymore. He is probably dying of internal bleeding, I would assume. And Vel injects him or hits him with a med spike, which I would imagine is kind of like adrenaline, or just is adrenaline, or what it's named in Star Wars, because he still needs to kind of plot their escape route, which he does manage to do. And once they eventually get away, there's kind of this decision on what they should do next. Should they take Nemec to some sort of contingency doctor in case somebody was wounded? That seems to be what Skeen is advocating for, whereas Vel is advocating for them to just carry on with the mission, and that he's probably going to die anyway. Ultimately, it's Cassian who makes the call to take the kid to the doctor, probably in large part because he has, I think, grown somewhat attached to the kid, and the kid did just save his life. He did shoot an Imperial who was trying to choke Cassian out and kill him, essentially. But before moving on, I want to backtrack just a second and talk a little bit more about the eye, not just about how cool I thought the whole thing looked, how visually impressive and kind of stunning it was. It brought a lot of life and color to this otherwise rather dreary and gray episode. But also, I really liked that you had this chieftain or spiritual leader, whatever he was, and you could see just how moved he was to be watching the eye, how important it all was to him, even though this is probably his 20-something time seeing the eye open up. It's every 3 years. He's probably, I don't know, in his 60s, 70s, whatever it might be. And you also saw some of the younger members of the Dahani kind of moved to tears. You saw that the Empire, the Imperials that were there, were also watching it, just captivated. Just thought that was a really cool, nice little moment to juxtapose again with this heist that, these rebels are using to get away. They're using the eye as this distraction, and it also helped them, of course, destroy the pursuing TIE fighters as well. Anyway, we then get to this cool looking planet, don't know its name, don't know where it is, or if it's a moon or whatever it might be, and we briefly meet Dr. Quadpaw. Now that is his name, and I kind of like the name because it harkens back to the old days of the Kenner action figures when they named characters like Walrus Man and Snaggletooth and Hammerhead. Very kind of on-the-nose names. Now, yes, those names have since been changed. They have kind of actual names. But for me, that was kind of a cool callback to the Kenner days, calling this character Quadpaw, calling him something very on-the-nose. Anyway, then we have the final confrontation, I guess you could call it, between Skeen and Cassian, and I like that Skeen kind of first talks about how luck drives the whole galaxy, which, of course, is not the case. We know that in Star Wars that there is the Force, there are prophecies, and so on, but from the common man's perspective, everything seems to be luck. The Force doesn't matter so much to him, and this is a show that is essentially devoid of Force users, so just an interesting way to kind of show the common man's view of the galaxy, that he doesn't feel like anything controls his destiny, even though we know it does. Or at least does to a degree. Skeen then proposes to Cassian that they split the some 80 million credits they've just stolen, that they can just fly away to a nearby moon that's like 8 parsecs away, and then after that go their separate ways. Skeen says how 40 million credits will help him forget Cassian ever existed. But what Skeen perhaps fails to realize is that Cassian is kind of in a no-win situation here. He can't say yes or no to the deal when you really think about it, because if he takes the deal, he's pretty sure Skeen is lying and going to betray him. He's okay with betraying everybody else in this group that he has come to know and care about, supposedly. However, if he turns Skeen down, well then Skeen has now outed himself as a not very for the cause rebel. He even says that he is a rebel, yes, but that he fights against everyone. So clearly this is not someone he can trust, and if he says no, Skeen is either going to try to turn it on Cassian, or he's going to kill him, or who knows what. So Cassian makes the decision to pull his gun and pull the trigger and kill Skeen before anything else can even happen. Now, as I was just saying, I understand the decision Cassian makes. It was about the only one he could make. However, I will understand if people don't find this to be a very noble act. It wasn't very noble. And one of the complaints I have seen about the series is that Cassian is not a very likable character. He's not a very heroic character. Why are we rooting for this guy who kind of kills people left and right, who maybe don't deserve it so much? And well, we know that the Cassian we see in Rogue One is going to be this person who will kill people for the cause. Now, currently he's only killing people more or less for himself. The change in Cassian isn't going to be so much his moral standards, I guess, as it will be what he fights for. Again, he's more or less fighting for himself, for the money, and maybe he has this desire to find his sister, which was mentioned in the first episode. In fact, I think the next story arc that will start in episode 7 will see him with this money trying to find that aforementioned sister. Anyway, for better or worse, basically what I'm saying here is you can't turn Cassian into the heroic character, and you could say that is kind of a flaw of the show, that why are we rooting for this guy? I get that, but again, he has to more align with what we see in Rogue One than have this turn to be heroic and then have something else turn him to be less heroic as seen at the start of that film. Moving on, we then find out that Nemec didn't make it, that he has indeed died. Cassian then tells Vel about Skeen, that he was going to betray them, and he gives the Kyber necklace back to her, telling her to give it to a Luthian essentially, and that he's just going to go his separate way. He's going to buy this ship from the Doctor, paying him double what it's worth. He's going to take his cut, and he's going to leave, and he doesn't really care about the rebellion. Vel then gives him Nemec's manifesto, and at first Cassian doesn't want it, but eventually agrees to take it. I'm sure he's eventually going to read it and start believing some of these things, perhaps. I don't know. I think that will, of course, be part of his turn. He saw that this kid gave his life for something greater, and truly Nemec did believe in the cause. He was someone who was fully on board with the rebellion, I think, unlike Skeen or maybe some of the others. We don't really know how their loyalties will shake out in the end, I suppose. We then get a few what you could call aftermath scenes before the episode concludes. We see sort of the ramifications of what has happened. We see the ISB gathering, talking about this heist on Aldani and what kind of response they should have, which is really interesting. I wonder if the Aldani people are now going to suffer because of this, or should I say suffer even more? We're then in the Senate building where Mon Mothma is giving a speech to only a handful of people. Most of the other senators are not present. And then she quickly figures out that everybody is kind of ignoring her and looking at their data pads. She picks up her own data pad and I'm sure learns that the heist on Aldani has been successful. Finally, we're back in Luthen's shop and he is selling a necklace. And I kind of like that this woman who is potentially buying it talks about how sad it was that this ancient language has been lost. And Luthen's like, nah, it's not that bad. You now get to make up what this language says. Anyway, Luthen then has someone who is in his shop asking about Aldani, if he has any relics from there. And you can see the look of fear on his face. And then when he's heading to the back, he learns from this guy that he's just joking, that there's been this heist there that was successful. And then you see his face shift to joy. And finally, to relief. I just loved the range of emotions that Luthen goes through in this short amount of time, from just terrified to just overwhelming joy that they were successful, to relief that it was successful and that hopefully nothing can be traced back to him now. And so in closing here, this was a fantastic episode. Easily the best so far, which isn't to say the other 5 weren't good, but this was just flawless. I have virtually no complaints other than calling a goat in Star Wars. I guess that's about the only thing I could nitpick, other than maybe a few tiny other little things. This has just been so well written. It's so refreshing to see. I don't want to say Star Wars take itself seriously, because I think Star Wars always takes itself seriously, but the writers to take it extremely seriously. That's the difference here between some of the other shows that we've gotten, and movies as well. It takes this galaxy very seriously. It gets into the actual nuts and bolts of the galaxy, how it functions, why people in this galaxy function the way they do, their beliefs, what shapes them, all of these things. So far, this show has been, in my opinion, pretty damn good. Well, that's all I got for you this time. So take to the comments below. Tell me what you thought of this episode, or what you think of this series overall. And again, I will be doing a Let's Talk Some Andor video over on my second channel, where I will be going over some of the comments left on this video. Either way, leave your comments below. Let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.